Please don't leave me. She wept. The cowboy stayed and witnessed the unthinkable. The autumn wind cut through Redemption Creek like a rusted blade, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of an early winter. Jake Morrison pulled his weathered coat tighter around his shoulders as he guided his chestnut mare through the muddy main street, past the saloon where piano music spilled out into the amber twilight. After 3 months of herding cattle across the Montana Territory, all he wanted was a hot meal, a warm bed, and enough whiskey to wash the dust from his throat. The town was settling into its evening rhythm when he heard it, a sound that made him rein in his horse so abruptly that she snorted in protest. It was crying, soft and broken, coming from the shadows between the general store and the blacksmith's shop. Jake had heard plenty of tears in his 42 years, from grieving widows to scared children, but something about this particular sound made his chest tighten with an inexplicable urgency. He dismounted slowly, his spurs jingling against the wooden planks of the sidewalk. "Hello?" he called out, his voice rough from days of shouting orders over the wind. "Someone there?" A figure emerged from the shadows. A young woman, perhaps 25, with auburn hair that had escaped its pins and hung in tangled waves around her pale face. Her blue calico dress was torn at the sleeve and stained with what looked like mud, though the reddish color made Jake wonder if it might be something else entirely. Her green eyes were swollen from crying, and when she looked up at him, the desperation in her gaze hit him like a physical blow. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Please, don't leave me." Jake glanced around the empty street, confusion creasing his brow. "Ma'am, I wasn't planning on—" "Everyone leaves," she interrupted, stepping closer. Her hands were shaking, he noticed, and there were scratches on her wrists that looked fresh. "They all leave when they find out. But you look different. Kinder." The woman swayed slightly, and Jake instinctively reached out to steady her. Her skin was cold as winter stone, and he could feel her trembling beneath his touch. Up close he could see that her eyes held not just desperation, but something deeper, a haunted quality that spoke of secrets too heavy for one person to carry. "What's your name, miss?" Jake asked gently, guiding her to sit on the steps of the general store. The wooden boards creaked under their weight, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled its lonesome song. "Sarah," she replied, wrapping her arms around herself. "Sarah Bennett. And yours?" "Jake Morrison. I'm just passing through, heading to Denver for work." He studied her face in the fading light, noting the way she flinched when he mentioned leaving. "What happened to you, Sarah? Who's been leaving you?" Sarah's laugh was bitter, devoid of any real humor. "The sheriff, for one. Doc Henderson. Even Reverend Williams." She looked up at him with those haunting green eyes. "They all said they'd help me, but when they learned the truth about what I've done, what I've seen, they ran like rabbits." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "What truth?" Before Sarah could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed down the street. 3 men on horseback emerged from the darkness, their faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats. The lead rider, a tall man with a silver star pinned to his vest, brought his horse to a stop just a few feet away. Jake recognized the type immediately, the kind of lawman who wore his authority like armor and wasn't afraid to use it. Well, the sheriff said, his voice carrying the weight of barely controlled anger. "If it isn't our little storyteller. Still spinning your tales, Sarah?" Sarah pressed herself back against the store's door, her face draining of what little color it had. "Sheriff Hawkins," she breathed. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just filling another stranger's head with your lies, I reckon." Hawkins interrupted, his cold gaze shifting to Jake. "Mister, I'd advise you to mount up and ride on. This woman is nothing but trouble." Jake felt his jaw tighten. He'd encountered his share of corrupt lawmen during his years on the frontier, men who used their badges to settle personal scores rather than serve justice. Something about Hawkins rubbed him the wrong way, and the fear in Sarah's eyes only strengthened his resolve. "She hasn't told me anything yet," Jake replied evenly, not moving from his position beside Sarah. "And last I checked, talking wasn't a crime in Montana Territory." Hawkins's face darkened, and his hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip. "You don't know what you're getting into, cowboy. This woman has been spreading vicious lies about respected members of this community, defaming good men with her wild accusations." "What kind of accusations?" Jake asked, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. Sarah grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his coat. "Please," she whispered urgently. "Don't ask. Just stay with me tonight. I'll explain everything in the morning, I promise." The two men flanking Sheriff Hawkins shifted in their saddles, and Jake noticed they both wore the same expression of barely contained hostility. One of them, a burly man with a scarred face, spat tobacco juice into the dirt and spoke for the first time. "Boss, maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Briggs," Hawkins snapped, never taking his eyes off Jake. "You've got one chance, stranger. Ride out now, or find yourself caught up in something that'll get you killed." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Jake could feel Sarah trembling beside him, could hear the rapid flutter of her breathing. Every instinct told him to mount his horse and ride away from whatever dark secret had turned an entire town against this woman. But something deeper, something that spoke to the core of who he was, refused to let him abandon someone who so clearly needed help. "I'll be staying at the hotel tonight," Jake said finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd faced down rustlers, wolves, and worse. "And the lady will be staying there too, under my protection." Sheriff Hawkins's smile was cold as a grave in winter. "Your funeral, cowboy. Just remember, I warned you." As the three men rode away, their horses' hooves clattering against the wooden street, Jake helped Sarah to her feet. She was still shaking, but there was something new in her expression now, a flicker of hope that hadn't been there before. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why are you helping me?" Jake looked down at her, this broken woman with secrets in her eyes, and felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. "Because," he said simply, "sometimes a man's got to choose between what's easy and what's right, and leaving you here alone with those wolves, that wouldn't be right." As they walked toward the hotel, Sarah's hand tucked into the crook of his arm, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this decision would change everything. The dying light cast long shadows across the street, and somewhere in the distance that coyote howled again, a sound that seemed to carry a warning on the wind. The Redemption Creek Hotel was a modest two-story building with creaking floorboards and wallpaper that had seen better days. Jake secured 2 rooms, one for himself and one for Sarah, ignoring the suspicious glances from the desk clerk, a thin man with nervous eyes who kept glancing toward the window as if expecting trouble to come riding up at any moment. "Room 12 for you, miss," the clerk said, sliding a brass key across the scarred wooden counter. His voice was barely above a whisper. "And room 14 for you, sir. That'll be $4 for both rooms." Jake paid without complaint, though he noticed how the clerk's hands shook as he took the money. Word traveled fast in small towns, and it was clear that Sheriff Hawkins's warning had already begun to spread. As they climbed the narrow staircase, Sarah moved close beside him, her footsteps soft on the worn carpet. The hallway was dimly lit by a single oil lamp, casting dancing shadows on the walls. When they reached her door, she turned to face him, and in the amber light, Jake could see fresh tears glistening in her green eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't remember the last time someone showed me such kindness." "Get some rest," Jake replied gently. "Tomorrow morning over breakfast you can tell me what's got this whole town so spooked." Sarah nodded, but as she started to unlock her door, she paused. "Jake," she said without turning around, "whatever I tell you tomorrow, please try to understand that I never wanted any of this to happen. Sometimes good people get caught up in terrible things, and there's no way out except through." Before Jake could respond, she slipped inside her room, leaving him standing in the hallway with more questions than answers. He made his way to his own room, but sleep came fitfully. Every creak of the building, every whistle of wind through the eaves, had him reaching for the Colt .45 on his nightstand. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones, and whatever Sarah Bennett was hiding, it was big enough to make powerful men nervous. Dawn broke gray and cold over Redemption Creek, and Jake woke to the sound of voices in the street below. He moved to the window and peered through the dusty glass to see a small crowd gathered around the sheriff's office. Even from his second-floor vantage point, he could sense the tension in their posture, the way they huddled together like cattle sensing a storm. A soft knock at his door interrupted his observations. "Jake?" Sarah's voice was muffled through the wood. "May I come in?" He opened the door to find her standing in the hallway, looking somehow both better and worse than she had the night before. She'd managed to wash her face and pin up her hair, but her eyes held a haunted quality that daylight only seemed to intensify. She wore the same torn dress, and Jake noticed she carried a small leather satchel clutched tightly in her hands. "I brought something to show you," she said, stepping into his room. "Something that might help you understand why they want me gone so badly." Jake closed the door behind her and watched as she moved to the window, looking down at the crowd below with the wariness of a hunted animal. "Sarah," he said carefully, "before you show me anything, I need you to know that whatever's in that bag, whatever you're about to tell me, it's not going to change my mind about helping you, but I need the whole truth." She turned to face him, and he saw her jaw clench with determination. "3 weeks ago," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "I was working as a seamstress for Mrs. Crawford, the banker's wife. It wasn't much, but it was honest work, and it kept food on my table. That Tuesday evening I was walking home from delivering a dress when I heard voices coming from the old mining office behind Main Street, the building that's been abandoned since the silver played out 5 years back." Sarah moved away from the window and sat heavily in the room's single chair, the leather satchel resting on her lap. "I should have kept walking, should have minded my own business. But the voices were angry, and one of them sounded like," she swallowed hard, "like someone was in trouble." Jake remained standing, his instincts telling him that whatever came next would change everything. "What did you see?" "I crept around to the back window," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It was cracked open just enough for me to peer inside. There were 4 men in that room standing around a table covered with what looked like maps and papers. But that's not what made my blood run cold." She opened the satchel with trembling fingers and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. Carefully, she unwrapped it to reveal a silver pocket watch, its surface engraved with intricate designs. But it was the dark stains on the metal that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. "This belonged to Thomas Garrett," Sarah whispered, "the rancher who disappeared 2 months ago, the one everyone assumed was killed by rustlers or wolves." Her green eyes met Jake's. "He was there in that room, Jake, tied to a chair, beaten so badly I barely recognized him. And Sheriff Hawkins was the one holding the knife to his throat." The room fell silent except for the sound of Jake's heart pounding in his ears. Thomas Garrett's disappearance had been news even in the neighboring territories. A wealthy rancher with thousands of acres and a substantial herd simply vanished without a trace. The official story was that he'd been traveling to sell cattle in Billings and never arrived. "You witnessed his murder," Jake said, the words feeling heavy in his mouth. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I watched them kill him, Jake. Sheriff Hawkins, Deputy Briggs, Mayor Whitfield, and," she choked on the words, "and Judge Coleman. They were arguing about land deeds, about some plan they called the expansion. Garrett had discovered something about their scheme and threatened to expose them." Jake felt a cold rage building in his chest. 4 of the most powerful men in Redemption Creek, including the very people citizens turned to for justice and protection, were murderers. "How did you get the watch?" After they killed him, they wrapped his body and loaded it into a wagon. But Hawkins dropped the watch as they were cleaning up. I waited until they left, then climbed through that window and took it. I thought it would be evidence, proof of what they'd done. But when you tried to report it, they said I was hysterical, a grieving spinster with an overactive imagination." Sarah's voice turned bitter. "Dr. Henderson suggested I might need treatment for female hysteria. Reverend Williams said I was clearly suffering from delusions brought on by too much isolation. And when I showed them the watch, they claimed I must have stolen it from Garrett before his disappearance." Jake ran a hand through his hair, trying to process the magnitude of what Sarah was telling him. "Where's Garrett's body now?" "I don't know. But Jake," she leaned forward, her eyes wide with fear, "there's more. The papers on that table, the ones they were looking at, they were property deeds, dozens of them, all the small ranches and homesteads between here and the railroad line. They're planning to force people off their land one way or another and consolidate it under some kind of development company." The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway made them both freeze. Jake motioned for Sarah to stay quiet as he moved to the door, pressing his ear against the wood. The footsteps stopped directly outside his room, and he could hear the soft murmur of voices. At least 3 men, maybe 4. "Morrison," Sheriff Hawkins's voice called through the door, artificially friendly, but with an underlying threat that made Jake's hand move instinctively to his gun. We need to have a word, open up. Sarah shot to her feet, clutching the watch and satchel to her chest. Her face had gone white, and Jake could see the terror in her eyes, the same look he'd seen on the faces of cattle when they sensed wolves circling in the darkness. What do you want, Sheriff? Jake called back, stalling for time while his mind raced through their options. The window led to a 2-story drop onto the main street, and there was nowhere else to run in the small room. Just want to make sure our visitor understands the situation here in Redemption Creek, Hawkins replied. See, we've had some reports of stolen property. Seems someone's been taking things that don't belong to them. Jake looked at Sarah, saw the resolve forming in her eyes despite her fear. She mouthed the words, "They know," and pointed to the window. But before either of them could move, the door exploded inward with a thunderous crash, and Sheriff Hawkins stepped into the room with his gun drawn, followed by Deputy Briggs and 2 other men Jake didn't recognize. Well, well, Hawkins said, his cold smile spreading across his weathered face. Looks like we caught ourselves a couple of thieves. The 4 men filled Jake's small hotel room like storm clouds gathering before a lightning strike. Sheriff Hawkins kept his gun trained on Jake while Deputy Briggs moved to block any escape route toward the window. The 2 strangers, both wearing expensive suits that marked them as outsiders, positioned themselves near the door with the practiced ease of men accustomed to violence. Now then, Hawkins said, his voice carrying the false courtesy of a snake oil salesman, I believe the lady has something that belongs to us. Sarah pressed herself against the far wall, the leather satchel clutched protectively to her chest. It doesn't belong to you, she said, her voice trembling but defiant. It belonged to Thomas Garrett, and you murdered him for it. One of the suited men, a tall, pale individual with steel-gray hair, stepped forward with a laugh that held no warmth. Sheriff, this woman clearly suffers from delusions. Perhaps she needs medical attention. Jake studied the man's face, noting the calculating coldness in his dark eyes. This wasn't a local. The cut of his clothes and the authority in his voice suggested someone with power that extended far beyond Redemption Creek's borders. Who are you? Jake asked, his hand hovering near his gun despite the weapons already trained on him. Marcus Blackwood, the man replied with a slight bow that managed to be both polite and mocking. I represent certain business interests with investments in this region, interests that have been disrupted by Miss Bennett's unfortunate tendency toward wild accusations. Sarah's face went even whiter at the mention of Blackwood's name. You're the one behind the expansion, she whispered. Garrett mentioned you that night, said you were trying to buy up the entire valley. Blackwood's smile was razor thin. Business is business, my dear. Progress waits for no one, and unfortunately some people are simply too stubborn to recognize opportunity when it presents itself. Jake felt the pieces clicking into place like bullets sliding into a chamber. So you had Garrett killed because he wouldn't sell. Now, Hawkins interjected, waving his gun for emphasis. That's a mighty serious accusation, Cowboy. Got any proof to back up such wild talk? Sarah's fingers tightened on the satchel, and Jake saw her jaw set with determination. I have his watch, she said. The one covered with his blood. The one you dropped when you were dragging his body away. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Briggs shifted nervously, his hand moving to the grip of his own weapon, while Blackwood's companion, a shorter man with the scarred knuckles of a professional fighter, took a step closer to Sarah. Miss Bennett, Blackwood said, his voice now carrying an edge of steel. I'm afraid you've allowed your imagination to create a very dangerous fantasy. What you believe you witnessed was nothing more than a business meeting. Mr. Garrett was very much alive when he left that building. Then where is he now? Sarah demanded, finding courage Jake hadn't expected. It's been 2 months and no one's seen hide nor hair of him. His ranch is sitting empty, his cattle scattered, and suddenly there are surveyors tramping all over his land. Jake watched the interplay between the men, noting how Briggs kept glancing nervously at Hawkins, how the scarred man's eyes never left Sarah, how Blackwood maintained his composure despite the increasing tension. These weren't desperate criminals acting on impulse. This was a carefully orchestrated conspiracy with roots that likely extended far beyond one dead rancher. The watch, Hawkins said finally, extending his free hand toward Sarah. Hand it over, nice and slow. No, Sarah replied, surprising everyone in the room, including Jake. I won't let you bury the truth with Thomas Garrett. What happened next unfolded in the space of 3 heartbeats. The scarred man lunged toward Sarah, reaching for the satchel. Jake drew his Colt and put a bullet through the man's shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the wall. Briggs swung his gun toward Jake, but Sarah had already moved, smashing the oil lamp from the bedside table across the deputy's skull and sending him stumbling backward in a shower of glass and kerosene. "The window," Jake shouted, firing another shot that sent Hawkins diving for cover behind the overturned chair. Sarah didn't hesitate. Clutching the satchel to her chest, she threw herself through the window in an explosion of glass and wooden frame. Jake heard her hit the wooden awning below with a crash that made his heart stop, followed by the sound of her rolling off onto the street. Blackwood's voice cut through the chaos like a whip crack. "Kill the cowboy, the woman needs to be taken alive." Jake put 2 more shots through the doorway to keep the men pinned down, then followed Sarah through the shattered window. He hit the awning hard, the old wood sagging under his weight before giving way entirely. He landed heavily in the muddy street, pain shooting through his left shoulder where it struck the ground. Sarah was already on her feet, her dress torn and her face streaked with blood from glass cuts, but her eyes blazed with determination. "The church," she gasped, pointing toward the white steeple visible over the rooftops. "Reverend Williams might help if he sees the watch." The sound of shouting from the hotel window above them spurred Jake into motion. He grabbed Sarah's hand and they ran, their boots splashing through puddles and mud as shots rang out behind them. The early morning crowd on Main Street scattered like startled chickens, diving into doorways and behind hitching posts. They reached the church just as the bell tower began chiming 7 o'clock. The heavy wooden doors stood open, and Jake could see Reverend Williams at the altar preparing for morning service. The man looked up in alarm as they burst through the entrance, Sarah's torn dress and Jake's drawn gun painting a clear picture of desperation. "Reverend," Sarah panted, rushing toward the altar with the satchel held out before her. "You have to listen to me. You have to see what they've done." Williams, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and graying hair, stepped back uncertainly. "Sarah, child, what's happened? You're bleeding." "Thomas Garrett," she said, opening the satchel with shaking hands. "They killed him, Reverend. Sheriff Hawkins and the others, and this proves it." She pulled out the blood-stained watch and held it up to the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows. The silver surface caught the colored light, and the dark stains were unmistakably visible. Reverend Williams's face went ashen. "Dear God," he whispered. "Is that his blood?" Sarah confirmed. "I watched them murder him, and now they're trying to silence me." The sound of heavy footsteps on the church's wooden porch made them all turn toward the entrance. Sheriff Hawkins appeared in the doorway, his gun holstered but his hand resting on its grip. Behind him came Blackwood, and another man Jake didn't recognize, someone with the soft look of wealth and the hard eyes of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Reverend Williams," Hawkins said, his voice echoing in the sacred space. "I'm sorry to disturb your morning preparations, but we have a situation here. These 2 are wanted for theft and assault." "Now, Sheriff," Williams replied, his voice steady despite the tremor Jake could see in his hands. "This is God's house. Whatever your business, surely it can wait until after." "I'm afraid it can't," Blackwood interrupted, stepping past Hawkins with the confidence of a man who owned everything he surveyed. "You see, Reverend, Miss Bennett has been telling some very disturbing stories. Stories that, if believed, could cause great harm to innocent people." Jake positioned himself between Sarah and the men at the door, his gun still drawn but pointed downward. The church felt like a powder keg, and he could sense that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether the truth about Thomas Garrett's murder would ever see daylight. "Show him the watch, Sarah," Jake said quietly. "Let the Reverend decide for himself what the truth looks like." Sarah held up the timepiece, and in the colored light of the stained glass, the engraved initials, TG, were clearly visible alongside the dark stains that spoke of violence and death. Reverend Williams stared at the watch for a long moment, then looked up at Sheriff Hawkins with an expression Jake had never seen on a preacher's face before, righteous anger mixed with profound disappointment. "Sheriff," Williams said, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority, "I think you'd better explain to me how a dead man's watch came to be covered in what appears to be blood." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Sarah's quiet sobbing and the distant toll of the church bell, marking the time in a town where justice hung in the balance. The silence in the church stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Reverend Williams stood frozen at the altar, the blood-stained watch catching fragments of colored light from the stained glass windows. Sheriff Hawkins shifted his weight from foot to foot, his hand still hovering near his gun, while Marcus Blackwood maintained his composure with the cold calculation of a man who had orchestrated far worse than murder. It was the third man, the one Jake didn't recognize, who finally spoke. His voice carried the refined accent of Eastern education, but underneath lay something that made Jake's skin crawl. "Reverend Williams," the stranger said, removing his hat to reveal silver hair and a face that might have been handsome, if not for the cruelty in his pale blue eyes. "Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Judge Harrison Coleman, Territorial Circuit Judge. I believe there's been a terrible misunderstanding here." Sarah's sharp intake of breath told Jake everything he needed to know. This was one of the 4 men she'd witnessed in that abandoned mining office, one of Thomas Garrett's killers now standing in God's house with the authority of territorial law behind him. "Your Honor," Reverend Williams said uncertainly, clearly struggling with the conflicting evidence before him, "I'm afraid I don't understand what's happening here." Judge Coleman smiled with practiced warmth, but Jake caught the flash of something predatory in his expression. "Miss Bennett has been suffering from what our good Dr. Henderson has diagnosed as severe hysteria, brought on by isolation and, shall we say, unfulfilled feminine needs. She's been constructing elaborate fantasies involving respected members of our community." "Lies," Sarah whispered, but her voice carried clearly in the church's acoustics. "Every word is a lie," Coleman continued as if she hadn't spoken. "The watch she claims belongs to the late Thomas Garrett was actually stolen from his ranch house during the confusion following his disappearance. We have witnesses who can testify to her presence there on multiple occasions." Jake felt the trap closing around them. These men had spent weeks, maybe months, constructing a web of false testimony and manufactured evidence. Against their combined authority, sheriff, judge, and whatever power Blackwood represented, the word of a desperate woman and a drifting cowboy would carry little weight. "Then where is Thomas Garrett?" Jake asked, his voice cutting through Coleman's smooth lies. "If he's alive as you claim, produce him." Blackwood stepped forward, his expensive boots clicking on the wooden floor. "Mr. Garrett, as I understand it, chose to relocate to California after selling his property to my development company. Men of business often seek new opportunities when the right price is offered. His cattle were found scattered across 3 counties, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. His horses were running wild. No man sells everything and leaves his animals to starve. The actions of a man in desperate financial straits, Judge Coleman replied smoothly. I'm afraid Mr. Garrett had accumulated substantial debts. The sale of his property to Mr. Blackwood's company was the only way to avoid complete ruin. Reverend Williams looked down at the watch in his hands, turning it over to examine the initials and the dark stains. If this watch was stolen as you claim, why is it... He paused, swallowing hard. Why does it appear to be covered in blood? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and inescapable. Jake saw a flicker of something. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear, crossed Sheriff Hawkins' face. But it was Blackwood who answered, his voice carrying the confidence of a man accustomed to buying his way out of any problem. Reverend, I'm afraid Miss Bennett's delusions have led her to disturbing acts of self-harm. The blood you see is her own, applied to the watch to support her fantastic claims. Dr. Henderson can provide medical evidence of recent wounds on her person, consistent with deliberate self-mutilation. Sarah's face went white. That's not true. The cuts on my hands are from breaking into the mining office, from the broken glass. Exactly what someone suffering from hysteria might claim, Coleman interrupted. The mind creates elaborate justifications for irrational behavior. Jake felt rage building in his chest like steam in a boiler. These men weren't just murderers. They were architects of a conspiracy so thorough, so carefully constructed, that they'd managed to turn an entire town against the one witness to their crime. They'd isolated Sarah, discredited her, and now they were painting her as a madwoman whose own actions had created the very evidence of their guilt. But as Jake watched the interplay between the 3 men, he began to notice something they hadn't counted on. Reverend Williams wasn't looking at them with the deference their positions typically commanded. Instead, the preacher's eyes held a growing skepticism that suggested he'd seen too much of human nature to be easily fooled by polished lies. Gentlemen, Williams said finally, his voice carrying a new authority. I've known Sarah Bennett for 3 years. She's worked in this community, attended services regularly, and shown herself to be a woman of steady character and sound mind. What you're describing doesn't match the person I know. Sheriff Hawkins took a step forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. Reverend, with all due respect, you're not a medical doctor. Dr. Henderson has examined her and— Dr. Henderson, Williams interrupted, who owes his gambling debts to half the saloons between here and Billings. Dr. Henderson, who prescribed laudanum for my wife's headaches until she nearly died from the addiction? The preacher's voice rose with righteous indignation. Forgive me if I question the medical opinion of a man who can barely examine patients without his hands shaking from withdrawal. The accusation hit like a thunderbolt. Jake saw genuine alarm flicker across the faces of all three men, the first crack in their carefully constructed facade. Sarah stepped forward, holding the watch up toward the light. Reverend Williams, look at the inscription inside the case. Thomas Garrett showed it to me once at the general store. It's engraved with his late wife's initials and their wedding date. With trembling fingers, Williams opened the watch case. Even from his position several feet away, Jake could see the preacher's face change as he read whatever was engraved inside. For my beloved Thomas, from your devoted Margaret, June 15, 1863. Williams read aloud. His voice carried clearly through the church, and Jake saw both Hawkins and Coleman exchange worried glances. A detail easily learned from anyone who knew the couple, Blackwood said. But for the first time, his voice held a note of uncertainty. Williams snapped the watch closed and looked directly at Judge Coleman. Your Honor, I've been preaching in frontier towns for 15 years. I've seen every kind of human failing, every variety of sin and desperation. But I've also learned to recognize truth when I hear it. He held up the watch. This woman didn't steal this timepiece. She recovered it from the scene of a murder. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Jake saw Hawkins's hand move toward his gun, saw the calculation in Blackwood's eyes as he weighed the costs of silencing a preacher in his own church. But it was Judge Coleman who provided the final, unthinkable revelation. You're right, Reverend, Coleman said, his cultured voice now carrying a tone of weary resignation. She did recover it from a murder scene. Thomas Garrett is indeed dead, killed by my own hand when he threatened to expose our land acquisition project. The admission hit the church like a physical blow. Sarah gasped, covering her mouth with her hands, while Reverend Williams staggered backward as if he'd been struck. Even Sheriff Hawkins looked stunned by Coleman's sudden confession. However, Coleman continued, drawing a small derringer from his vest pocket. Miss Bennett made one crucial error in her account of that night. She claims to have witnessed 4 men in that mining office. In truth, there were 5. Jake felt the world tilt on its axis, as Coleman's pale eyes fixed on Reverend Williams with cold satisfaction. You see, the judge continued, our good Reverend here has been our inside source from the beginning. Who better to know which ranchers were struggling financially, which families might be convinced to sell, which properties would be most valuable to our development project. Coleman's smile was that of a snake savoring its prey. Reverend Williams has been providing us with information for months, taking his percentage of every successful acquisition. Williams's face had gone ashen. That's not true. I would never. The 30 pieces of silver in your church account say otherwise, Coleman said. Money that can be traced directly to payments from Blackwood Development Company. Sarah looked between the 2 men with growing horror. No, she whispered. Reverend Williams, tell me it's not true. The preacher's silence stretched like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I never intended for anyone to be hurt. They said they just wanted information about who might be willing to sell. The church needed the money, and I thought I was helping families get good prices for their land. By providing intelligence for a conspiracy that ended in murder, Jake said, the pieces finally falling into place. Coleman nodded approvingly. And now, Reverend, you have a choice. Help us clean up this mess or join Mr. Garrett in whatever grave he's currently occupying. The derringer remained steady in his hand. Miss Bennett and Mr. Morrison have heard too much. Their deaths will be tragic but necessary, perhaps killed while resisting arrest for theft and assault. The church fell silent except for the sound of Sarah's quiet sobbing and the distant whistle of wind through the bell tower. Jake realized with crystal clarity that they were all about to die in this sacred place, victims of a conspiracy that reached deeper than he'd ever imagined. But as he looked at the blood-stained watch still clutched in Reverend Williams' trembling hands, Jake saw something that Coleman and his partners had missed in their careful planning, a truth so devastating that it would destroy them all, regardless of who lived or died in this moment. "Judge," Jake said quietly, his hand moving slowly toward his gun. "Before you kill us all, there's something you should know about that watch." Coleman's eyes narrowed. "What?" Jake smiled grimly. "It's not the only evidence Sarah recovered that night." The words hung in the air like the toll of a funeral bell, and Jake saw the first flicker of real fear cross Marcus Blackwood's face as the unthinkable truth began to dawn on them all. What did you think of Jake and Sarah's harrowing journey through the corruption of Redemption Creek? Were you shocked by the final revelation about Reverend Williams's involvement in the conspiracy? Drop a comment below and let me know which twist caught you off guard the most. I love hearing your thoughts on these frontier tales of justice and betrayal. If you enjoyed this story of courage in the face of overwhelming corruption, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping Western dramas that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more stories from the untamed American frontier.